This video explains the formation of a U-shaped valley. So U-shaped valleys or glacial troughs are originally formed from river valleys which are shaped like the letter V. So initially you have a V-shaped river valley that looks a little bit like this. So it has steep sides in the shape of the letter V, but a very narrow base. And one thing you'll remember from studying rivers is that river valleys have things called interlocking spurs. So where there's pieces of rock sort of coming down from the sides of the valley, and the river does not have enough power to break through these, so ends up flowing around these spurs, making them interlocking. So we have interlocking spurs on our V-shaped valley. Interlocking spurs. So the river flows around the interlocking spurs because it doesn't have that much erosive power. So during glaciation, snow is able to build up in these sheltered V-shaped valleys. So over time, we end up, just like with our corrie, we end up with snow building up and building up and building up until eventually it compacts and turns to ice. So we end up with ice in the bottom, névé in the middle, and the fresh snow on top. So in our sheltered valley, we have a buildup of snow, as I say, which compacts and turns into névé and then turns into ice. And once it becomes a glacier, it is able to move under its own weight and due to gravity and can flow down through the valley and move. So once our U-shaped valley has got the glacier in it, it looks a little bit like this. So our valley has totally changed shape, which has been caused by the ice. So what's been happening is we've had various processes, so lots of our glacial processes going on here. So the first one is, first thing we need to remember is that this ice is moving. So this ice is moving downhill, and as it moves, it's able to do certain processes of weathering and erosion. So freeze-thaw is one process that is happening here, where above the glacier, there are rocks on the sides of the valley. Water gets into the cracks in the rock, the water freezes overnight, and then because the water is frozen, it expands, putting pressure on cracks in the rock, and a repetition of that process eventually causes bits to break off. So freeze-thaw happens above the glacier line here, and it causes the sides of the valley to steepen. So freeze-thaw steepens the valley sides above the glacier. And the glacier itself is also causing the valley to change through the processes of plucking, which mainly happens on the sides, where pieces of rock are frozen to the sides of the glacier, and as the glacier moves, it's able to rip those pieces of rock away from the sides of the valley, making them steeper. So plucking also steepens the valley sides. And finally, we have abrasion. So again, abrasion happens most of the way around our glacier edge here, and abrasion works where there are pieces of rock embedded in the ice, and they stick out the bottom, and when the ice moves, those rocks wear away the surface below and scour away that surface. So abrasion deepens the valley floor. So there are three processes of erosion happening here: weathering, plucking, freeze-thaw, plucking, and abrasion, all changing the shape of this valley. So as it moves downhill, these processes continue to happen, widening, deepening, steepening the sides of this valley. Now in our V-shaped valley, we had our interlocking spurs because the river didn't have enough power to flow through those pieces of rock. It had to go around them. Whereas now the ice has got so much power, it's able to sort of bulldoze down through all of that, and it knocks the interlocking spurs out of the way and makes them become truncated. So once the ice is melted, we're left with quite a different shape to our valley. So here, these steep sides, the spurs have now been truncated. So truncated spurs which basically is the really, really steep sides of our valley. The valley has a very wide, flat floor, so a much wider floor than before. Before, the base of our V-shaped valley was very narrow, now it's quite wide. And there's a couple of different features that you'll find here. There's often a river that will flow through the base of the valley because it's quite low down. And this is known as a misfit stream. And the reason for that is that it doesn't really fit with this valley. So the valley is almost too big for that stream. It doesn't fit in there. Here, we may also have elongated or very long lakes or lochs, where maybe the glacier was able to erode more deeply. Maybe it was more powerful here, it was moving faster here, or maybe the rock below is not as strong as the surrounding rock. And water can then accumulate here, forming a ribbon loch or ribbon lake. So you often see this in U-shaped valleys, really long and thin lakes in the middle. And then finally, we have this feature here. Now, I don't know if you spotted on the last diagram, during glaciation, as well as our main glacier, being this big glacier here, just like a river, we also get smaller glaciers, which are like tributaries. So a smaller tributary glacier in a smaller valley that becomes part of the main glacier. And once that melts, we end up with the valley it was in hanging above the main valley. So because the glacier was smaller, it wasn't able to erode down as much, so it's not as heavy, it's not as powerful. So the erosion isn't as much as the main glacier. So it doesn't erode down to the same level for the floor. So this leaves this valley hanging above the main valley. So this here is called a hanging valley. As I say, caused by the smaller glacier. Exactly the same processes happened here. So we had a small glacier, we had plucking on the sides of this small valley, abrasion on the floor of the small valley, but because it was a small glacier, not as much erosion happened. And once that ice melts, we end up with often a small river in it, and because these rivers are at two different heights, often a waterfall will form in between them so they can meet. So you'll notice our valley has become wider from the initial V-shaped valley. It's become deeper, the sides have become steeper, and it's also become straighter. So V-shaped river valleys often would wind down as a river would meander along, whereas a U-shaped valley tends to be very straight because the glaciers had enough power to basically bulldoze everything out of its way.